Hi everyone, it's James here, and in this tutorial we're going to be taking another sketch design and converting it into a concrete HTML and CSS website. The main difference with this tutorial is we're going to be at the end adding some navigation, which is just a few simple icons and allows you to move between different sections of the site. And we're going to add some animations to actually scroll the content in and out. So keep watching to see how that's done, but let's take a look at the design that we're going to be coding up today. Okay, so this is the design that we're going to be coding up in HTML and CSS. It's just a sketch document, and I'll put a link in the description below if you want to actually go and download this yourself. But I've been through and actually extracted all of the graphics and color codes, and they're in the project already. So if you want to go and clone the project from GitHub, you'll have all of those available to you already. So as I said, towards the end of the tutorial, we're going to be aiming to get this navigation here on the left-hand side working. And when you click on one of these little dots here, what we'll actually do is change the content that's on the page by sliding about some of the content that's already here. So we're going to be focusing on the header and then this main section here with the two columns, and then also this footer on the left-hand side here as well. So that's an overview of the design. We'll be coming back and checking in that we're actually matching this as we're going along. But the project that we've got set up, there's a few things in here just to point out. We've got a basic skeleton structure here, and I've also preloaded a particular Google font which matches the design as well. I think it's the actual font that's in the design that's been used, which is this Playfair here. And also over here in the style section, I've also created some variables and preloaded all of the colors that have been taken from the sketch document. So that's just a little bit about the project. We'll get started now by actually creating some of the markup so we've got something to style. So first thing we're going to do is create a header. So we'll create a header element in here. And inside that header, I'm going to create another div with a class of container, which we'll use to actually center up some of that content within the header. And we'll use this container class elsewhere as well so that all of our other content lines up as well, just by adding a bit of margin and padding. And then I'm going to add 3 images in the top header bars. So first of all, if we have a look inside of our images folder, inside of our project, we've got this arrow image, which I've extracted from the design. There's also the logo as well. So I've actually extracted this from the design rather than having to rely on any heading level 1 tags to actually recreate that. The font was a bit awkward to create the same sort of effect. And we've also got this magnifying glass and also a menu item too, which is a kind of half hamburger. And then there's the 2 pictures of the models from the actual original design. So one for the footer and then another one for the main image. So that's just a bit of an overview of the images that we've got in this folder here. So the first thing we want to do is use the magnifying glass. So inside that images folder, there is the magnifying glass PNG. And let's put some alt text in there as well. We'll say it's search. And the next one is the one that's in the center of the page, which is the logo. So let's just pop that in there as well. And we'll just say, I think the actual overall template is called Awaken. So we'll say it's the Awaken logo. And then finally, we've got one more on the right-hand side, which is the menu.png. And we'll just put in there for the alt text menu. So you can see we've got our 3 images in our header. Before we go any further with the markup, let's actually style that so that it's appearing as it should be. So over in our style sheets, we're going to put in here some styles for our header and also the class of container. But just before we go and do those, let's actually add some styles that will be global to the rest of the page. So this is going to be for the body and for all of the elements. So the first thing I'm just going to do is set box sizing to be border box, just so that padding doesn't affect the layout of our items on the page. And as I mentioned, the body tag, let's do some resets here. So we'll say the margin is 0, padding is 0. And because the design fills the entirety of the page, what we're going to do for this example is set the height to 100 viewpoint height units. So that's basically just saying the body is going to span the entire height of the available browser screen. Just to be sure as well, we'll say the width is 100%. And the background color, I'm just going to set that to the dark variable that we've got created up above. And then also, whilst we're here, we'll set the font family to the Playfair. Display is the name of the font. And if that's not available, we'll just use any old serif font that the browser can find. Okay, so that's our body set up and all of our resets in place. Let's actually move on to the header tag that we were working on just a second ago. So I'm going to set a height for the header of 10 viewpoint height units. So this way we'll know exactly how much space the header is taking up, and it'll be useful later on when we move on to looking at how to actually slide the content up and down as well, because we'll want to keep the header in place. And I'm also going to target the container class that's inside the header, And I'm going to say the display of that is flex, and just make sure the width is 100% of the header container. And we'll say the justify content is space between. And just to make sure everything's lined up, we'll say align items is centered. So I've actually targeted the container class that's inside of our header here because I want some specific rules for this container, but we also want to have some margin on that as well. And I've actually targeted the container class outside of that main header element so that it can be used elsewhere as well. So we'll just put some global padding on here of padding left. And we'll use viewport width units here so that we know that it'll be 10 units of the viewport width pushed in from the left. And if we look at the design, you can see that will just give us some space here over on the left-hand side for that nav element. You can see there's no padding on the right-hand side here. It's just here so that we've just got some space to put these buttons in later on. So that's pretty much matching up with what we've got. But you'll notice also the menu has a different background color as well here, and there's some space around that. So let's go and add that in here too. But we'll just need to adjust our markup slightly here because I want to actually put this into another div. So let's create a class of menu for our div and then put our image inside it. And then back in our style sheet, let's go inside of the header again. And we'll target that menu class and we'll say the background color, and we'll use the light variable this time. And then let's just give it some padding. Let's use some specific pixel values here. So 30 pixels on the top and bottom and 20 on the left and right. And you can see that now has a different background color. And because we've got padding on this as well and all the items are aligned, it actually pushes the other two down in line with that as well, the logo and also the magnifying glass. So we don't really need to worry about putting any specific padding values for the header or the container inside that. This block here actually handles that for us. Okay, so that's pretty much the header done. Let's actually move on to the main section. Let's go and add some markup in for that main section now. So just after the header, we'll use a main tag. And pretty much the only thing that's going to be in here is an ordered list that will give a class of pages. And there's going to be several list items inside of here, and each one of those will be a slide or a section of the page which we're going to be sliding in later on. But just for the moment, we're just going to create one list item inside here, which will hold our main content. And then when we work on the interactive element later on, we'll just copy this list item a few times and change some of the content. Okay, so what are we going to put inside of these list items? Well, it's going to be everything in this main section here. So we're going to have two columns and then the footer down here. So we'll have a column over here for this text and then a column on the right for the image. And then the footer will hold all of this content down here. So let's stub those out. We'll have a div with class of left column. And then we'll have another div with a class of right column. And because the footer actually is on the left-hand side and it's in the sort of bottom left, we're going to put that directly inside of the left column. So before we work on that, let's actually put another container element inside of our left column here. And inside that, we'll have a heading level 2 tag with some of the text, which was story of the week for the first slide that we're working on. And then directly underneath that, we'll have a paragraph tag, and I'll just copy the text in from the actual design as well, which was obviously just some summary of a fashion week that was going on. So let's just save that. Okay, so that's the content for the left column, and the right column is actually going to be pretty simple, really. I'm going to put a div in here with a class of image, and what I'm actually going to do is in here, I'm actually going to put an inline style of background image. And from there, I'm going to load the image of the model, .jpg, which will actually just set that large image as our right column's background image. And the reason I'm not doing this in our CSS is because we can literally just copy this content later on and actually just edit these images if we have multiple images. So we can just use this one CSS image rule here, rather than creating multiple CSS rules just to handle different images for the different slides that we're going to be creating. Okay, so before we go any further with the content, let's style these two columns just so that we can see how they should be looking. So within our main elements in our page, I'm just going to make sure it's taking up the rest of the page by saying it's 90 viewpoint height units. And then I'm going to target our ordered list with the class of pages. And then we'll set some rules up for this just so that it's appearing as it should be. So 100% height of the containing main element, and also just check that it's 100% of the width as well. And we'll take off any margin and also padding here, which comes with the unordered and ordered list HTML element, so we'll take that off. And the other thing which is quite important, but you won't see it at the moment, is just set the overflow as hidden. So we're going to be having multiple list items in here, and we're going to be sliding them up and down depending on when the user uses the nav. So we don't want that content to be displayed anywhere else on the page. So once it's gone out of this ordered list container, we want those items to be hidden. So one important thing that I'm going to do here just before we move on to styling the list items and the columns themselves is to actually set up some CSS counters. So CSS counters are quite cool because we can actually use them to keep track of some numbers for us. And the way we do that is to use the counter set rule, and then we can just basically give a name to the counter that we're setting up. So we're going to have one for the header, and I can initialize that with a value of 0 or any other number that I like here. And I'm also going to add another one, which is next page, which I'm going to initialize as 1. And basically these are going to correspond to these numbers here. So you can see here we've got 0, 1 and 0, 2. So I'm going to use these counters to actually keep track of these numbers for me. I'm going to increment them for each of the slides that we're adding. So this just means that when we do move on to working on the nav, I don't need to go in and put in these numberings automatically. The counters that we're creating will keep track of those values and update them for us. So you'll see how that works in just a second, but we've just set up those counters here that we can use within the rest of our rules. Okay, so let's access the list item that's going to be directly inside of the page's ordered list. And again, we just want to make sure that the height is 100%. And then we're going to set the display property here to flex to create those two columns for us. And what we'll do here, just to show you about the counters, is we're going to increment the header counter by 1. So for the first list item, the header will receive a value of 1 before anything's displayed to the page. Okay, with that done, we're going to set some rules up for the left column, and they're also applicable to the right column as well. So let's target that class there. So I'm going to set the position of these to relative, and also set their flex value to 1, so they take up an equal amount of space on the page. And we come back to those in just a second, but just let's get the image displaying on the page as well. Let's make sure that's 100%, and also the background size is cover. So you can see we've got our two columns now, and they appear to be of equal width at the moment, which is good. We're going to run into a problem with this text in a second, because in the actual design, you can see it's quite large and it overlaps in this second column here on the right hand side. But let's actually go ahead and style that text first, and I'll explain what I mean. Okay, so let's target the heading level 2 tag that we've got, and we'll set its font size, and we'll just use a value of 50 pixels and say it's quite large. And it's all in uppercase in the design as well, so we'll say the text transform is uppercase. And it's reasonably bold as well, so we'll set the font weight to 600. And the colour, we'll use the primary variable that we've got set up in our style sheet. And I'm also going to set a white space property of no wrap. So this rule actually tells the heading level 2 tag not to wrap the text and to overflow out of its container if it needs to. But you might have noticed when I added that rule that it's actually pushed the right column a bit more onto the right hand side of the page, which means our columns aren't actually equal anymore. And this heading level 2 tag, we actually want it to overflow and overlap this image as well. So if I take that rule out for a second, you'll see that the column and the image on the right hand side move back in. So we actually want to have this rule in, but there's a little quirk in Flexbox which is actually causing this. And after a bit of Googling, I found out that if we actually add a bit of min width, or rather if we set a min width of 0, if we actually add that rule in there, you can see that the columns actually are equal again, and this text is actually overlapping the right-hand column. Of course, because the right-hand column appears after the left-hand column in the document flow, it's actually sitting behind it. So what we can do is just use a bit of z-index to set our left column to be 2. And then the right column will set the Z index to be 1. So there you go, we've got our text actually overlapping, which if you look at the design is kind of what we're after. So with that done, let's actually go back and style the rest of this section here. So the next thing we want to do with the heading level 2 tag is we want to set up our numbering system. So I'm going to target the before pseudo selector here, and I'll set the display of this to block, so that it appears on one line, and we'll set a bit of margin on the bottom of this element and just say 30 pixels. And we're going to have a massive font size on this as well, so let's go a little bit bigger than the actual H2 tag itself. And then for the content, so this is what actually displays within the element, I'm going to use a string value of 0, and then I'm going to append onto that the value of the counter, the header counter, and then finish it up with a period or full stop. So you can see we've got this element now representing what slide we're actually looking at. And when we do add more slides, this will actually update automatically for us. So we don't need to worry about this in the actual HTML content of the page, which as you'll see will be quite useful. So that's looking pretty good. The only thing in this section now is to actually target the paragraph tag as well. So let's set the color of this to primary, and I'll also set the line height of this to be 2, just so that the text is spaced out a little bit more. And the padding right, just to push it in a little bit more so that there's a bit more space between the columns. And just looking at the design, the font size of that could probably do with being raised a little bit. So let's say 20 pixels, I'll try that. Maybe let's go down to 18. Of course, you can play around with this a bit more if you want to fine tune this design. So that's the 2 columns pretty much sorted, but we need our footer section at the bottom left here. So we're going to be adding this as a footer element, and we'll have an image, and again, we'll have another heading tag here and a button which would take us to the next slide as well. So first of all, let's go back to our markup. So we're actually going to put another set of ordered lists inside of here. So we'll give that a class of next pages, and there'll be a list item inside of here. Which will contain a div with a class of next page. And I'll create another div which is going to contain the thumbnail image, and I'll just put that in as an actual image itself. So we have model 02 as the image. I'll just say next page as the alt text. And there'll be the heading level 3 tag in the center there, which said Brightside Collection on the example of the design. And then finally, one more div, and we'll give that a class of next arrow, with the image inside it, which has the arrow image that we had, and we'll also give that alt text of next page too. Okay, so those are all the components of the footer. Let's head over to our styles and actually make those appear in line with the design on the page. So first of all, we'll target the footer element that's inside of our lists, and we're going to set the position of this to absolute, which means we can then say we want this footer to actually appear at the bottom of the page. And we'll just ensure that it's all the way over to the left-hand side as well. But we do want to make it stretch 100% of this first left column. And with that done, we can target the ordered list that's inside there, and it had the class of next pages. And again, we'll do some resets as we did with the other ordered list. So we'll take off the padding and margin that's there. And we're also going to set the overflow to hidden. And again, make sure the width is 100%. And from inside of there, we can then target all of the list items that are going to be appearing. And let's first of all set the width to 100%. And I'm going to set a specific height on this as well. So we'll say it's 150 pixels. Rather than using the containers padding, I'm just going to put a manual 20 pixels padding on the left-hand side there. And then I'm just going to set the background color to the light color. So we want all of the items inside of here to display in a row. So we'll set the display to flex. And I'm going to, this time, actually set the align items to stretch. So this just ensures that the items inside of there will actually take up 100% of the height by stretching them across there. And we'll also say the align content, so these are the actual items themselves. On the horizontal axis, we'll just make sure that they're centered. And finally, just to say that there's some space between them as well, we'll justify the content as space between. And I don't seem to be able to see all of the content in there for some reason. Let's just check our markup's correct. Okay, so in the list items, we've also got this next page class as well, just to contain everything. So probably want to target that inside of here. So inside of the list items, we've got the next page class, and just wrap all of that inside of there and tidy things up. Okay, so we've got all of the additional content appearing now. Okay, so we need to also increment our footer counter as well, but this is actually one step ahead of the header counter, which is why we need an additional one. So we'll increment the next page counter, so that should be set to 2 on its first use. And then when we come to target the H3 tag, we can actually make use of that counter as well. So here's our heading level 3 tag. To remove any margin from that at the moment, and we'll also set it to display as flex. We're going to set a flex direction of column, a color of primary light, which is slightly just lighter than the actual primary value that we've got for the other headings up here. Want a bit of a larger font size, so we'll set 25 pixels. And again, it's in uppercase as well, so we'll say text transform, is uppercase. And we'll use a medium font weight of 400. And we'll do a similar thing that we did with the other heading level 2 tag where we're setting the numbering up. So the before element, we want the font weight to be 600. The font size to be a bit bigger, so we'll say 40 pixels. And the color to be primary light again. And then finally we need some content, so we'll do the same thing again. We'll have 0, counter, next page, and then a full stop after that. Okay, so you can see that pretty much matches the design that we've got here. The last thing is this button on the right hand side. So we'll set the next arrow to display as flex, and we'll align the items inside there, which is just the arrow image itself, to be centered. And we'll set the image height to be 20%. And we'll remove any padding on the top and bottom, but we'll add some on the left and right. And finally, we'll set the background color to be a value that's stored in the lightish variable. So those rules don't seem to be taking effect again, so let's have a look. We did create a class of next arrow. Oh, I think we're still in the H3 tag here, so that won't work. So let's just save that. Okay, so with that class moved outside, those rules are now taking effect. And one last thing, we'll just put some padding on the image here because the thumbnail's actually not taking up 100% of the height, the actual image itself. So we'll just say some padding of 20 pixels, say. And the image itself, we'll just reduce the overall height of that to 70%. Oh, that's probably a bit too much. Let's just say 90% and just check the design. And as you can see, that's pretty much in line with what we've got for the footer element here. But the important thing to note as well is you can see that this counter has been incremented automatically. And again, if we're going to add more items into this section here for the footer when the page changes, then we don't need to worry about updating that ourselves in the markup. Okay, so before we actually add that interactivity, we need to create the nav element that was down here with the actual buttons to press. So we'll go into our markup and actually do that first, and then we'll add some styling to it. So let's go into the top of the main element itself, and we're going to add a nav. And to represent each of the buttons, the small circles, I'm just going to create a class of page, and we can just add that into our nav element as 4 divs. And also we want to make sure that one of them is actually selected as well. So we'll add a selected class to the last one. Okay, so we don't see anything on the page at the moment, so let's go and actually style those elements. And we'll just, where do we go into the main section? Right up here. We'll add our navigation rules up here. Okay, so targeting the nav element, we're going to set its position to absolute because we want to put it somewhere specific on the page. And we'll say it's 500 pixels from the top of its parent element, 40 pixels in from the left. And just to make sure it doesn't overlap anything or it appears on top of everything, we'll just set its Z index to 20. So we created each div with a class of page, so let's target those. Again, we'll set the position to be absolute and the border radius to be 50% to give us the circle effect, a specific height, 6 pixels, and we'll also go same for the widths of 6 pixels. And if we give the background color of the page element specific colors, we've got the nav variable that's containing one of the colors from the design. You can see we've got our navigation buttons appearing on the left hand side here, but of course they're all stacked on top of each other at the moment because the position of all of them is the same. We'll fix that in just a second, but finally let's just set the cursor to pointer so that when we hover over it, it looks like it's a button that you can click. Okay, so let's fix the positioning of those. So first of all, I'm going to target the second page element that we've got, and I'm going to set its top value to 30 pixels, which in turn just pushes it down. Then I'm going to target the third one and set its top value down by 60 pixels. And finally, the fourth one, we'll set its top value to be 90 pixels. Okay, so that's got those navigation elements appearing on top of each other now. There's a few more rules to add in. We want to actually target the hovered state as well, just to make a few changes. So we're going to change the background color to nav selected, which is another of our variables. And we'll also just make the height a little bit bigger, so we'll say 8 pixels. And same sort of thing for the width as well, so it stays in proportion. And we just adjust its left value just ever so slightly. And if we try hovering over those now, you can see they just get marginally bigger and the color changes, just for a bit of visual indication that we're hovering over that particular element. So we're just going to also use the same rules for when they're hovered, so that it shows that one is actually selected, and looks like we've got that round the wrong way. Yep. Okay, so let's put the selected class on the first element here. Okay, so we're showing as the first slide is selected, and then it looks like we can click onto the next ones as well. So that brings us to actually adding in the interactivity, and we're finally at a point now where we can actually wire up some JavaScript to actually make this navigation change the content that's on the page. So let's first of all do that by creating a new file. So over in our source folder, we'll just create a index.js file. And before we write anything in there, in our actual HTML, let's load in that JavaScript file too, and we'll just put it at the bottom of our page here. So a script source of index.js. Okey-doke, so let's go back to our index.js file. So what we're aiming to do here basically is to create an event listener for each of these elements, so that when we actually click on them, we actually make a transition on the page. So we could do that individually, but let's actually just grab all of the elements and save them into a variable. So we can do that by creating a new variable called nav_elements, and we'll use a query selector all to grab from the navigation all of the elements that have a class of page. And what we can do with that is we can actually then loop through them, and for each of those we'll grab the actual element itself, and we'll also keep track of which one we're looking at via its index, which we'll use to actually slide the page by a certain amount. So for each of those elements, we can set up an event listener, and the event listener, of course, is click. And what we actually want to do is grab all of the page list item elements and actually move them on the page by a certain amount. So let's grab a list of all of those. So we'll say for each of the page li elements. So basically in our markup, it's going to be in this section here. Inside of our pages, we want all of these list item elements. Of course, there's only one at the moment. So we'll say a document.querySelector all again, and it will just be pages and all of those list item elements. So we're going to loop through all of those using a for each. And for each of those list item elements, I'm just going to target its style property, and in particular the transform that's inside of that style object. And what we're going to do is we're going to say we're going to translate the y value of each of these list item elements by a certain amount. So if you imagine this is one of the list items on the page at the moment, we're actually going to move it up by a certain amount, depending on which navigation button's been clicked. So if we want to move an item up on the page, we actually need to translate it by a negative amount. And inside of our JavaScript here, we're just going to grab the index value that we've got in our main for each loop that we're in here. And I'm going to multiply that by 90. And why 90? Well, 90 is the actual viewpoint height units that we're taking up in this main list item section. So we're going to translate it by whatever index position we're in, multiplied by 90 viewpoint height units. And that should actually be inside of the braces there. So if now I click on one of these buttons on the actual navigation, you can see the existing content disappears, but if I go back to the original one, the content reappears, because clicking on one of the other items means that the existing list item that we've got has been moved off the screen, and because the overflow is hidden, we don't see it. And if we go back to the original one, it reappears. So we're going to make that slide in and out in just a second, but before we leave our JavaScript, we also want to update the currently selected navigation element here too. So I'm going to get a reference to that by saving in a variable currently selected the result of a query selector, and it is inside of our nav element the page that is selected, or at least has the class of selected. So for the currently selected item, I'm going to remove from its class list the selected class. And because this element here is the one that's currently being clicked when this event is fired, we can just say, well, that's the one that's currently selected. So in our class list for that particular element, we're going to add the selected class to it. So if we just test that out now, if we actually click on one of these other navigation items, you can see that that's the one that's currently selected. So if we go to the other ones, whichever one we click on is the one that has the selected class applied to it. Okay, so there's two last things to do. The first thing is to actually add some more markup into these containers so that they match up with the navigation that we've got. And literally all I'm going to do for each of the list items that are inside of the pages, I'm just going to copy that a couple of times, well, 3 times to be exact. And now if I actually click on the different navigation buttons here, you can see that the content is updating, the actual list items are updating. We can only see that from the numbering at the moment. But if I go up to the new markup that we've just added and maybe change some of the text in here, you can see that that's the next slide there. And of course you can go through it and customize all of this content on each individual slide. But the only thing is it's a bit difficult to know that the content's changed, and that's obviously because we're using the same images and the same text and things at the moment. The only thing that's changing really is the numbering, but we can make that a bit more visually obvious by adding some transitions in. So in the pages ordered list, for each of the list items, what we could actually do is set a transition property. And we'll just transition everything 0.6 seconds. So now when we skip between slides, you can see all of the content is sliding. So it's a bit more obvious that we're moving between the different sections. So that's just a bit of simple animation to show you how to actually move between the different slides. And as mentioned with the counters that we've set up, you can see that the numbering all stays in line. So if we were to add more slides or to take any away, we don't need to worry about any of that in our markup. That's all just handled for us automatically by using those CSS counters. So that's pretty much it for this tutorial. Hopefully you've learned a few things about layout and also some techniques for working with numbered lists. And of course the main thing that we did different in this tutorial was to create the navigation as well for these slides. You can see all you need is a simple bit of JavaScript to actually target these elements and then just slide the overall content up and down to get this full page effect with hidden content. So that's it for this tutorial. Don't forget to subscribe to support the channel and so you don't miss out on any future tutorials, and I'll see you next time.